Welcome to panel 2 of MacDiarmid at 100. Some of you were probably at panel 1 this morning, and I hope you enjoyed that. If you weren't at panel 1 this morning, my name's Scott Lyle, and I'm going to be chairing the panel this afternoon. Like this morning, we have 4 speakers with us, and I'll come on to that in a moment. This event has been run under the auspices of the Scottish Revival Network, and we're also have organised this event really to think about MacDiarmid in relation to the 100 years anniversary of him first appearing in print in the Scottish Chapbook in August 1922. The papers this afternoon in the panel, which is named Concepts and Peripheries, are thinking in many ways about MacDiarmid in conceptual terms, and also in relation, in some cases, to MacDiarmid's later work, whereas this morning we tended to look at MacDiarmid's earlier work. As I say, there are 4 speakers this afternoon: Alexander Linklater, Fiona Patterson, Alex Thompson, and Jim Benstead. So I'm just going to introduce our first speaker now, so he might want to start sharing his slides with us now, and that's Alexander Linklater.
Oh dear, it's not letting me share the slides, Jim.
While you're trying to figure that out, I'll just introduce you, Alex. Alexander Linklater started his MacDiarmid journey in the early 1990s as a postgraduate student at the Department of Scottish Literature in Glasgow, before escaping into journalism. Since then, he's been literary editor of the Herald, arts editor at the London Evening Standard, deputy editor of Prospect magazine, and books editor at Axon Johnson Foundation in Sweden, covering topics from the EU to nationalism. He has made literary programmes for BBC4 and STV, where he presented the Scottish Book of the Year Awards, and he was founder of the BBC National Short Story Award at Radio 4. As a magazine writer at The Guardian, he developed a line in psychological case histories, writing up profiles of unusual personalities, which eventually led him back to the strange case of Christopher Murray Grieve, whose biography he is currently trying to write. And Alex's paper is entitled In Search of CMG, the Peculiar First Person in Hugh MacDiarmid's Poetry. Alex, over to you.
Thank you very much, Scott. Hope you can hear me. So this is MacDiarmid saying explicitly what Patrick was talking about this morning in conversation with Duncan Glenn in 1968 at Brownsbank. You have criticized the biographical approach, says Glenn. You don't think that a knowledge of your life is all that important. MacDiarmid, yes. But wouldn't you say that the biographical approach will help to link a lot of your poetry and perhaps make it clearer in some respects? Well, it might do, but where are they going to get the biographical facts from? It's a revealing conversation with Glenn for a number of reasons, I think. Here we have the prolifically autobiographical MacDiarmid dismissing inquiries into the biographical Christopher Murray Grieve, or CMG as I'll call him, with characteristic misdirection, wrong-footing his interviewer, who then fails to ask the obvious question. The obvious question being, could he not provide the facts himself? But even if Glenn had gone in harder with his interrogation, it's unlikely that a plausible answer would have been forthcoming. There are a lot of sham facts about, you know, CMG goes on, without pausing to consider who might have been responsible for spreading such calumnies. There will have to be an enormous process of correction before they get down to an accurate biographical understanding. The question of how accurate or inaccurate were his own accounts of his life is not one that he was ever asked to address. Anyway, Glenn proceeds as if relieved to have disposed of the subject. The search for a relationship between the life and the work is merely the concern of innocence. Indeed, CMG concurs. Such speculations have got to be weed a war. As an innocent myself, however, it's the real life CMG that interests me, and I should state from the outset that I don't believe notions of a split personality, a container of multitudes, or even a performative MacDiarmid persona are very helpful for understanding who he was and why he wrote the way he did. The standard formula for explaining the Grieve-MacDiarmid phenomenon is that he was a cantankerous firebrand in public and what Norman MacKay described as an amiable fuddy-duddy in private. But even this distinction was probably more imagined than real. When speaking publicly, CMG would merely break into a rather strident broadcast mode, during which he'd say whatever was most likely to rouse or antagonize his audience. But although he possessed a peculiar charisma, he had no great actorly range as a speaker, and his delivery didn't involve any noticeable transformation of personality, at least not of the kind people would subsequently misremember as they swapped hilarious or appalling MacDiarmidian anecdotes. The late financier Angus Grosset gave me a nice first-hand example of one such distorted recollection. In 1964, Sir Angus had been a junior advocate involved in the legal action raised by CMG against Alec Douglas Hume, in which he accused the Tory Prime Minister of a violation of the Representation of the People Act. Aged 72, CMG had contested the PM's Kinross and West Perthshire constituency as the Communist Party candidate. At the count, CMG emerged with 127 votes to Sir Alec's 16,659 and famously demanded a recount. When asked by puzzled officials why he wanted one, CMG was reported to have said it was because he couldn't believe there were that many communists in Perthshire. Now, that one's too good to spoil with fact-checking, but the subsequent legal case wasn't a joke. Though CMG lost his action, it raised questions about prejudicial media coverage that would have an impact on future electoral regulations. What loomed for Angus Grosset nearly 60 years later as he recalled the incident, however, was not the nature of the case, but the spectacle of MacDiarmid in court. At one stage, CMG stood up to contest a point out of turn, while his wife, Valda, tugged at his jacket tails, hissing at him to sit down and stop making a fool of himself. In Sir Angus's precise lawyerly memory, CMG retorted furiously to Valda, "Bugger off, you bloody whore." I discussed this incident with Colin Hamilton, co-collector of the MacDiarmid papers, and CMG's daughter-in-law, Deirdre Grieve, the only two people still living to have known him intimately in both his personal and, for want of a better word, professional capacities. Deirdre, a former journalist and amanuensis to MacDiarmid, was and remains his most meticulous observer. She could easily picture the scene, she said, the image of Valda tugging at Christopher's jacket to correct him as he got the formalities muddled. That part of Sir Angus's recollection was typical enough of the pair of them. But Deirdre and Colin unequivocally agreed that the idea of CMG shouting at Valda, let alone calling her a whore, was inconceivable, as in fact was the idea of him shouting or swearing at anyone, ever. It's worth bearing in mind when encountering the many examples of vituperation, verbal violence, and ad hominem attack in the works of MacDiarmid, that not only did he not himself shout or swear, he scarcely, if ever, lost his temper. Whatever rages he may have stoked on the page, there were no extremes in CMG's presentation of himself. Michael Grieve once described the surprise of visitors meeting his father for the first time, only to discover his excessive ordinariness. It's interesting to note how often others, friends, enemies, relations, even Mike himself, would nevertheless adapt their memories of CMG to fit their idea of him as MacDiarmid. What's even more interesting is how CMG would adapt memories of himself. When Duncan Glen spoke to him for their Acros interview in 1968, CMG's public profile was a relatively new phenomenon. Glen's study, Hugh MacDiarmid and the Scottish Renaissance, had been published in 1964, only 2 years after the publication of the collected poems in 1962, which was the first time anyone had been able to read across the range of his poetry in a single volume. This was also the year of the Festschrift, an anthology of essays produced by Colin Hamilton's partner, Coolgand Val, the first book-length account of Hugh MacDiarmid ever to be published. In The Company I've Kept, CMG described 1962, the year of his 70th birthday, as the breakthrough. Before that, the only real sources of information about him were to be found in letters to the press or some of his own little read articles, perhaps in his poetry, but mostly in his turgid anti-autobiography like Lucky Poet. The mainstream Scottish press took little interest, and there was no equivalent of Alan Bald or Alan Riach collecting his prose across multiple handsome volumes. CMG's reputation had been sustained among ardent but minor nationalist, literary and communist circles, few of whom questioned whether the contents of Lucky Poet credibly described a real person. Even the Scottish Renaissance of the 1920s and 30s was, in Glen's own words, a minority movement in which the key players were insufficiently well known to come under personal scrutiny. Possibly the most widely read account of the Renaissance to have been written while it was actually happening was my grandfather Eric Linklater's affectionate satire Magnus Merryman, in which CMG appeared as the compelling but mysterious Hugh Skene. In the novel, Magnus undergoes a conversion to the nationalist cause and prepares for his first meeting with Skene by reading his new volume of poems, the Flochterspord, a bit of Cod Scots that might translate as the wild flapping. CMG loved this version of himself, presumably because, despite the parody, it placed him at the center of events. But Magnus notes of the reception to Skene's work that the critics were, as usual, divided into two factions, one party calling it a work of superlative genius, the other declaring it to be gibberish. The general public, meanwhile, being ignorant of its existence, reserved their opinion. Prior to the creation of Hugh MacDiarmid in 1922, we view CMG through a glass darkly. There is no surviving letter in which we hear a contemporary voice speaking to him. Circumstantial facts may be checked, but the narrative of what happened to him personally has been extrapolated largely from his own assertions. In his critical biography, Alan Bald's reconstruction of the first 30 years, understandably, took CMG at his word. So what kind of a narrator was he? If his first letters to his teacher and mentor, George Ogilvy, are anything to go by, the 19-year-old CMG was something of a fantasist. While working in an undefined capacity for the Monmouthshire Labour News, he makes a series of increasingly improbable claims. He didn't sleep for 4 consecutive nights while war corresponding about the Tredegar riots. He has been instrumental in establishing 4 new branches of Keir Hardie's Independent Labour Party. As Michael Whitworth mentioned this morning, he has implausibly been corresponding with the French astronomer Camille Flammarion, and he has also reported on 3 triple murders. But what's odd about the accounts of himself in his early letters to Ogilvy are not the claims themselves, which range from the possible to the preposterous, but the way he frames them, or rather, the way he doesn't frame them. He routinely states events without descriptions, circumstantial details, or even his own point of view. He doesn't describe how he feels, and he doesn't quote other people. He provides very little of the when, where, how, or why. Mainly, it's just the what. This absence of context has 2 effects. It makes his facts very difficult to check, and it makes the reader fill in the gaps with assumptions about what must have been happening. Incidents come and go in the flash of a sentence, never to be mentioned again, so that our eye glosses over the incongruities. Why, for example, have we heard so little about the historic Welsh atrocity of the 9 Tredegar murders of 1911? What's fascinating are not just the red herrings he slips in, but the major plot lines he leaves out. He writes almost nothing to Ogilvy about his posting in Salonika in 1916, not much about his malaria, and confoundingly little for a self-proclaimed reporter about the theatre of war in which he's found himself. Ogilvy is clearly puzzled. This bothers CMG too. So he claims that he has, after all, written 200,000 words about it, still in draft. He will never again refer to this manuscript, but he does send Ogilvy a short sketch entitled Casualties, which superficially appears to draw on his time in the Royal Army Medical Corps, though it is bizarrely set in the Somme, where CMG has never been. CMG presents it to Ogilvy without remarking on this incongruity or acknowledging it either as a fiction or what it is more likely to be, which is a borrowing from another writer. An audit of the sham facts scattered throughout the correspondence and prose of Hugh MacDiarmid might lead to accusations of con artistry, were it not for the fact that they serve little apparent purpose except to obscure whatever is actually going on. He wrote many articles, but was no reporter, nor was he a very convincing teller of tall tales. He doesn't try very hard to persuade anyone to believe untruthful things about him. He merely doesn't correct them when they do. He has no empirical inclinations. Discrepancies appear like ticks, hinting at events that haven't occurred, company he hasn't kept, places he hasn't visited, languages he can't speak, films he can't have seen, composers he hasn't heard. His readers then join the dots and colour in the gaps to create MacDiarmid. It was Scott Lyell who pointed out the obvious to me, the strange resonance of CMG referring in his interview to Glenn to sham facts. Has he internalized Edwin Muir's denunciation of Scottish culture, unconsciously fearing that along with Burns and Scott, he too could be a sham bard of a sham nation? I prefer to think of the discrepancies as clues, quirks of an atypical personality, providing hints of a strange methodology. How does he generate the space-time leaps of perspective in his poetry? The universe like an eye turned inwards, cat's eyes staring back outwards into an unknowable darkness, the remote earth obscured by a blizzard of memories, the brains of the drunk man glimpsed in a puddle like the ripple of Eve's intestines. Take Blind Man's Luck. He just sits oolin' ower the fire, and gin a body speaks to him fegs, turns up the whites o' his een like twa oon eggs. I've right the bike o' heaven, quo he, and wha my sex should be, I've stuck the tomb doubts of the sun and moon for luck. Let's call it a portrait of the abnormal but lucky poet producing his cosmic effects, replacing ordinary sight with something empty but astronomical. Whatever it's really about, this is how he does it. The first verse comes from volume 2 of Jameson's dictionary, a single line about oon eggs, and then far away from the O's in the middle of the D's in volume 1, he's spotted a link between the oon eggs and the tomb doubt of an egg, which gives him his second verse. Pulled together across hundreds of pages of dictionary text, the two lines are suggestive of something eerie and new. CMG hasn't been searching for the words to describe a blind man by the fire. He has made the blind man up out of the words that he's found in Jameson's. The poem comes from a kind of wormhole he has discovered through the dark matter of dictionary text, from eyes turned up like peeled eggs to the very niche proverb, better half egg than tomb doubt. And he achieves this inside a steel trap-like metrical structure. It's a hell of a neurological feat. And this is how he wrote The Little White Rose. You know our wild Scots rose? It is white and small and prickly and possesses a sharp, sweet scent which makes the heart ache. It's a line from a speech for radio by Compton Mackenzie, the transcript of which was republished by the Scots Independent in their December 1929 issue. CMG would have seen it at the top of the page like this, in what typesetters call a widow. A time-pressed editor has slapped down the copy, letting the final line fall onto the top left-hand corner of the next page, and having run out of space, he just cuts the rest of the speech. So we will never know which rose Mackenzie was actually talking about. Was it the Burnet rose that grows wild in Scotland, or the Jacobite Rosa ex alba, which does not? Even as he sniffed a wild one, Mackenzie may have had the young pretender on his mind. But why did Bonnie Prince Charlie himself choose a white rose? Might it have been because it had been the white rose of the House of York in what Walter Scott would later dub the Wars of the Roses? Was it originally an English rose? CMG had no more interest in historical or horticultural verisimilitude than he did in representations of personal history. What he glimpsed was a promising line in a typesetter's widow, and with a virtuoso instinct for verbal structure, transformed a snippet of ersatz Jacobitism into a perfect lyric. no one would accuse him here of plagiarism. But do we see a change? Do we later see a change in MacDiarmid from this kind of creative transformation of found material into the plainer copy and paste method of In Memoriam James Joyce? And might he be doing the same thing with his own life, moving from the bristling self-creations of his early career to the merely unreliable records which in his old age he left for others to correct? Or was the method there from the beginning, carved into its illegible stone all the way from Annals of the Five Senses to mature art? Scholars from Bill Herbert to Patrick Crotty to the Scottish Revival Network's own Jim Benstead have done much of the intellectual heavy lifting, digging out the taproots of the MacDiarmid oeuvre. Jim has confirmed that at least 60% of In Memoriam James Joyce comprises the exactly transcribed words of other writers, the same likely being true of the remaining 40%, with only linking sentences being original to CMG. The mapping of the mosaic of his sources, made possible only by the age of the internet search engine and the digitization of world literature, reveals one of the weirdest wonders of 20th century poetry. But searching for CMG through the sleights of mind of bloody hell. Beg your pardon. But searching through CMG through the sleights of mind of a poem called In Memoriam that memorializes nobody and has no remembering subject, I wonder what purpose the first person in his poetry serves. The subjective point of view may turn out merely to be a function of syntax in a larger modernist poetic strategy, an incidental grammatical vehicle with which to explore the world of words. Another way of looking at it, however, may be that he composed this way because of the kind of guy he was. What this realistic mood into which my mind falls like a plummet through the neutral zone of its balanced doubt, never for one single beat of time can shake or disturb, is my certain knowledge derived from the complex vision of everything in me, that the whole astronomical universe, however illimitable, is only one part and parcel of the mystery of life. Of this, I am as certain as I am certain that I am I. The astronomical universe is not all there is. These words sound so like MacDiarmid, the complex yet clear declamatory rhythm, the assertion that another world is not just possible, it is a certainty. And yet they were written by John Cooper Powys. And not only that, they were written by Powys in his autobiography, in the first person about himself. CMG wrote that down under the name of MacDiarmid. The question being not merely what's going on poetically, but who would do that? It's a question that takes us back to the obscurity of his sense of himself, his fantasies of genius, and his role as a figment in the imagination of modern Scotland. And the answer, I think, makes for a great story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much indeed. Wow, lots of questions to ask you in terms of writing a biography about such a man, but we'll come round to that in the end. I should say, I should have said at the start, if you have questions for our panelists, please pop them in the Q&A just as they're speaking, as we're going through, and we'll come to those. We'll pick those up at the end. But thank you very much to Alex Linklater for that big thing. So our next speaker is Fiona Patterson, who is a final year PhD student in the Scottish Literature Department at the University of Glasgow. Her thesis is entitled Hugh MacDiarmid, Poetry and the Modernist Idea of a World Language, and her research explores MacDiarmid's experimentation with linguistic forms and categorizations within the hybrid poetic space. Fiona is interested in the literature of the Scottish Renaissance more generally, and in women's writing of the modernist era. She has recently published an open access article in the Scottish Literary Review on Rachel Annan Taylor, a contemporary of MacDiarmid's. Fiona has tutored in Scottish literature at the University of Glasgow and at the Scottish University's International Summer School in Edinburgh. The title of her talk is Archipelagic Distinctions, Plurality, Particularity, and Decentralisation in Hugh MacDiarmid's Vision of World Language. Fiona, over to you.
Okay, so just check I can share my screen first. I think is that working? Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you for the introduction, Scott, and thank you to everyone for their papers so far. I've been scribbling away as if I don't have enough things to research already. But yeah, it's been great. So I will get into it. In Hugh MacDiarmid's poetry, cultures and languages meet and interact, exchanging perspectives, insight, and creativity. We've heard quite a bit today about where he gets this language and these languages from. I guess I'm more interested for now in how he uses them. I'm going to explore MacDiarmid's approach to language as an archipelagic approach, hopefully drawing some helpful connections between MacDiarmid's time in Shetland and the vision of world language which he proposes in Memoriam James Joyce. In his borrowing of language, his attempts at synthesis and his juxtaposition of linguistic forms, MacDiarmid suggests and instigates what Thompson denotes as fluid movement across porous margins, a key characteristic recognised in an archipelagic philosophy. The period of productive isolation, which he spent on Wolsey in Shetland in 1933 to 42, and his travels from here to other Scottish islands, saw MacDiarmid retreat into what John Brannigan has referred to as geographical areas which have remained remote from the encroachments of a debilitating English modernity. Through this, MacDiarmid developed an archipelagic perspective which celebrated plurality and savoured the languages of local knowledge and particularity, collectively opposed to the invasion of standard English and imperialist oppression. This built upon his navigation of a Gaelic idea in the 1930s and the focus on Celticness, which persists in later work, guided by a belief in maintaining an alternative to the other because it is all part of the richness of life. Whilst each language which MacDiarmid references and borrows from might symbolise the distinctiveness of a singular island, the world language which he envisions in Memoriam James Joyce in 1955 resembles the collective, the archipelago. In MacDiarmid's vision, both specificity and commonality are central, ideas that I will focus on today. In his Stony Limits poetry in 1934, which was directly informed by the Shetland experience, and in the islands of Scotland in 1939, the Scottish archipelago is a recognisable and distinct influence upon MacDiarmid's creative project. However, the idea of seeing Scotland, if not Britain, Europe, and the world, as an archipelago transpires far earlier. It does so most notably in 1924, when MacDiarmid, writing as J.G. Outerstone Buglass, quotes himself in imagining that there was no England and never had been, and Scotland was, like Ireland, an island off the coast of Europe. Scotland, he continues, is coterminous with the universe, foregrounding, through emphasis upon Scotland's coastal borders with the continent, the intrinsic connectedness of island experience, defined less by its grounded isolation and more by its watery reaches out to the rest of the world. In Penny Week, 1926, MacDiarmid also includes adaptations of 3 short Cretan poems, Under the Greenwood Tree, which we heard Patrick mention earlier today, The 3 Fishes, and The Robber. His recourse to Cretan poetry is perhaps a nod to his experience in Salonika and the war, and his imagination of the Greek land and seascapes that lay beyond his limited freedoms on the Western Front. Yet that's as far as islands really reach in MacDiarmid's consciousness, until his move to Shetland in the 1930s. MacDiarmid considered his relocation to the Northern Archipelago in 1933 to be a virtual expatriation, having inserted physical distance between himself and the nation as he knew it. It was a case of so near and yet so far, immersion in an alternative Scottish experience and identity, which, whilst far in space, remained no further from the centre of things, no further from the great warm heart of humanity. Shetland, referred to as a burnt-out star, introduced MacDiarmid to distinct forms of Scottish language other than his familiar Lowland Scots, English, or even Gaelic. This concern is most famously present in On a Raised Beach, as MacDiarmid includes Norn within the various linguistic approaches that he trials in an attempt to understand the austere natural environment of Shetland's rocky landscapes. In adopting Norn, which declined following Scotland's acquisition of Shetland and Orkney from Norway in the mid-15th century, and which was considered to be extinct by the mid-19th century, MacDiarmid acknowledges the scale of deep geological time throughout which the environment has adapted and shaped itself. Norn is trialled because of its particularity, as we see in the extract beginning here. I try with the Old Norn words. Knowledge of the local landscape is indicated as being built into the language which grows out of it, and thus MacDiarmid uses it as a tool with which to access understanding and to get into the stones. Within the poem, however, in which definitions are not provided, the vocabulary becomes more rhythmic and musical, a language without recognizable words. Sound prefaces meaning, and the speaker in the poem must rely on their basic senses to navigate their environment, trusting that their openness to the unknown will pay off. MacDiarmid returns to this local ecological authority of Norn in Memoriam James Joyce, as he invokes the vocabulary within his patchwork of languages related to particular localities, cultures, and applications. Consider this in the extract quoted here, which begins, or even as in the Shetland Islands where I lived, I know in the Old Norn language the various names applied to all the restless movements of the sea. And then he gives us a catalogue: D, da mother D, soul, trove, hack, burrick, bod, brim, and so on. The context of this poem is not local in the same way as Honoré's Beach was, and yet it's propelled by the same desire to move beyond oneself and to attune to foreign forms of expression. As opposed to the existential uncertainty of Honoré's Beach, the poetic voice of In Memoriam asserts its vision more securely, confident in its utilisation of the unfamiliar vocabulary, as illustrated by the explicit provision of definitions here, an intentional proposition of knowledge, understanding, and reliability. MacDiarmid's experimentation with Norn is complemented by his evident reverence for the working class people of Shetland who utilise a local dialect within modern conditions. MacDiarmid writes from an attachment to place that Nicholas Allen has considered to be symptomatic of archipelagic writing, locally grounded, but at the same time involved in a network of cultural exchange. He purposefully picks up language and ideas from those around him, as we've heard quite a bit about today. And in Shetland, his attempts to write a poetry that would do the Shetland fisherman justice results in the Shetland lyrics, published in Stony Limits, which are snapshots of island living and contemplation. In some of the lyrics, such as With the Herring Fishers, MacDiarmid includes dialogue which he might have encountered whilst out on the boats. Swim on, bonny heron, swim on, they shout, or come in, oh come in and see me. Other lyrics, such as Colliforth in winter or De Profundis, capture the barrenness of the seascape when not in the presence of the Shetlanders. And I quote here from De Profundis, I delight in this nothingness more than ever I did, in the creation it yielded and has aimed. In the absence of the locals, their experience, their speech, their language, MacDiarmid's Shetland is populated by birds and the movements of the seas. It's a distance from human culture, but it's not a complete isolation from the world. The seas and oceans, as well as the coast and the land, serve as an integral space within MacDiarmid's assertion of a holistic national identity and his proposition of a planetary consciousness, guided by the connection between solitude and universality. And then it's from Shetland, of course, that MacDiarmid embarks upon the island travels which inform his 1939 Batsford travel guide to the islands of Scotland, a reinforcement of archipelagic plurality within this universal network. We might relate his findings here to Chris Bongy's recognition of the island as, on the one hand, the absolutely particular, a space complete unto itself, and thus an ideal metaphor for a traditionally conceived unified and unitary identity, on the other as a fragment, a part of some greater whole from which it is in exile and to which it must be related. MacDiarmid approaches the islands by sea, a space which Brannigan encourages us to think of as a space of connection and communication, and which proves key to his understanding of the archipelago as a framework of journeys and flux. It's such travel and movement within this, which Alexander Campbell considers to have fueled MacDiarmid's emergent archipelagic poetics that emphasises interconnection and interaction. In the Islands of Scotland, MacDiarmid writes that Scotland is broken up into islands other than and to a far greater extent than merely geographically. But what does this mean? The islands of Scotland is overwhelmingly an affirmation of diversity and unity, considered within Scotland as a microcosm of the world. He surveys their differences in the way in which they relate to one another, writing that they are of all shapes and sizes. No symmetry of effect is obtainable. She seems to have no control over them. Several groups appear to have escaped from and concerted movement of which she is the centre altogether. And while some remain in groups, others are isolated stragglers. It is a chaotic spectacle seen from above. Authority is not imposed upon the islands from above, remaining a chaotic spectacle despite belonging to a wider system. The islands are autonomous, representative of a devolved power and unique separate identities, and MacDiarmid recognises in them an alternative to the imperial framework of authority and organisation. By remaining attentive to these minute distinctions, for which he claims to have a Scotist love, Campbell argues that MacDiarmid avoids the production of homogenising narratives of place, retaining an element of local particularity, which remains key to his vision of world language. He asserts through this that in order to know any island, it is necessary to know many islands, a prelude of sorts to the sentiment of In Memoriam James Joyce, that a language is a form of life, but there are many forms of life. Plurality is central to both. We see this in the second quote here as well. They are not endless, these variations of form, though it is perhaps impossible to see them all. It is certainly impossible to conceive one that doesn't exist. The languages which MacDiarmid incorporates within In Memoriam, invoked to counteract the transmissive necessity of the poem's English, are presented as individually distinct and yet connected, autonomous and yet cooperative. The smallest are incorporated and celebrated alongside the most expansive, the centres of authority, as well as the isolated stragglers. His vision is concerned at one moment with the whole of world literature and equally concerned the next with Vogel, the smallest of the Finno-Ugrian language group, spoken by only 5,000 people. It too is a chaotic spectacle seen from above, an impenetrable seeming archipelago of vocabulary, referentiality and understanding, which MacDiarmid refuses to prescribe a simplified order or hierarchy upon. The size of a language is taken as no indicator of its value, the smallest components representative of the most specific and distinctive experiences and identities which ought to be retained and supported. And MacDiarmid's also interested in the way that languages affect one another within this, how they are similar to Elizabeth de Lowry's description of islands as vital and dynamic loci of cultural and material exchange. Thus we see references to Creole languages within his worldly vision, for instance, Papiamento, a Caribbean Creole influenced by Spanish, English, Dutch and African as a result of imperial slave trades, which MacDiarmid cites as a mixture of half the languages on earth. This is also how we end up with a passage like this, in which, borrowing from more knowledgeable linguistic sources, presumably, MacDiarmid incorporates contemplation of both the links and differentiations between Britain's Celtic languages and the dialects which they consist of. We see connections drawn between Breton, Gaulish, Spanish, Welsh, French, and so on, a complex network which begins in Scotland, moves outwards to the British Isles, to Western Europe, and eventually reaches beyond. Later on in the poem, it's a similar concern which sees MacDiarmid end the poem as he does, quoted here. With this consideration of local variations of pronunciation across South America, language is highlighted as it lives and changes in speech. It's inherited and adapted throughout history in a trajectory which is recognized as continuing long beyond the limits of the poem. But this is all something to discuss further another date. The challenge of redressing historic tensions between imposed imperial languages, i.e. English, and the diverse suppressed native languages of colonized regions is a central concern in Memoriam, which decentralizes expected linguistic authority and destabilizes English through the relentless injection of foreign elements. In archipelagic terms, to represent the mainland is not enough in itself, while the distinctive island and marginal characters contribute to a holistic understanding of its tradition or culture. MacDiarmid calls upon a cacophony of voices, expressions, and cultures in the poem in a rejection of standardization, arguing that all dreams of imperialism must be exercised, including linguistic imperialism, which sums up all the rest. In this context, the initiation of interaction and exchange between languages, which MacDiarmid visualises in the poem, suggests a collective and anti-imperialist stance. The languages are connected despite their differences, much like the invisible bridges which he saw as linking every one of the Scottish islands. The bricolage or mosaic approach which MacDiarmid adopts throughout much of In Memoriam helps to ensure that this distinctiveness of each individual element is retained, the momentum of the poem propelled onward by the pursuit of an agreement or cooperation between them. While he himself might have intended for an effective interpenetration, it was Edwin Morgan who aptly argued that it was more suited to being described as collage, a practice of organisation rather than creation or neologism. The poem might also be described as an epic exercise in heteroglossia and polyphony, the Bakhtinian concepts of coexisting linguistic variations within a single language, and the literary utilisation of these variations. Bakhtin's theory of dialectics was primarily confined to the discourse of the novel, but MacDiarmid experiments with how the poem might operate as a subjectively constructed hybrid space in which languages do not exclude each other, but rather intersect with each other in many different ways. In doing so, he highlights the necessity of collaboration and collectivity, expressed through language, but pertaining to deeper socialist values in the achievement of change. His polyphonic language, envisioned within the poem, represents a hybridity and the inhabitation of multiple cultural worlds, which Ramazani argues is not an aspect, but the basic fabric of the post-colonial poem. Collectivized against the homogenizing heavyweight of standard English, the plurality of languages used and referenced in Memoriam also serve a purpose which Susan Stanford Friedman has recognized in the collage poem more generally, the defamiliarization that what we take for granted is universal. MacDiarmid's approach then, a polyphonic archipelago, I've said that word too many times, archipelago, which groups languages yet falls short of imposing any authoritative order, intentionally challenges global hierarchies of power and expression, a disruptive vision which breaks from the current trajectory he perceives society to be on. Now, I hope this idea of the archipelago has helped to visualize the priorities, which I understand to have informed MacDiarmid's vision of world language in Memoriam James Joyce. Much as he had perceived in Shetland and as he had witnessed on his travels around the Scottish coast, the key to finding a shared expression and identity was a dual emphasis on plurality and particularity, navigated and proposed within a fluid, decentralized collaboration and exchange. It was a vision which was, in degrees, both idealistic and limited. Yet it drew upon the sure reality of the world's geographies and communities, and its affirmation of the centrality of language within the human experience as communication, expression, understanding, and authority continues to resonate. And that's enough for today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Fiona. That's great to hear about the archipelagic MacDiarmid. Thank you very, very much. Lots of questions I'm sure people will have for later. So our next speaker is Alex Thompson, who is Professor of Modern Literature and Critical Theory and Head of the School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures at the University of Edinburgh. He is co-editor of the book series Engagements with Modern Scottish Culture at Edinburgh University Press and is currently completing work on an edition of Memories and Portraits for the Edinburgh edition of the complete works of Robert Louis Stevenson. His paper relates to an ongoing project with the provisional title Constructing Scotland, Literature, Culture, Politics from 1970 to 2020. And his paper today is entitled Provincialising MacDiarmid. Alex.
All right, I'm going to attempt to share something. So you should be able to see one slide.
Yep.
Good. Now I can't see it, but I'm just going to talk. Okay. The paper is quite abstract, so I always thought it's helpful if people have something concrete to look at. And of course, the relationship between the particular and the universal, or the concrete and the abstract, is kind of what's central here. So this paper is called Provincialising MacDiarmid, and it will make some suggestions about the potential of recent calls for decolonisation of teaching and research as they might be applied in modern Scottish literary history. And taking as a central case study the most influential Scottish poet of the 20th century, Hugh MacDiarmid, I will ask what it might mean to provincialise MacDiarmid in the sense posed by Dipesh Chakrabarti in his well-known book, Provincialising Europe, while recognising what I see as a provincialising effect, which is already central to MacDiarmid's own cultural criticism. After all, who can claim to have so excoriatingly provincialised the Scotland of his day more unequivocally, unendingly, and it seems unreasonable not to add hyperbolically than MacDiarmid? So I'll begin by saying something about current work in decolonisation before mapping out what I take to be the influence of post-colonial studies on the evaluation of MacDiarmid since the 1990s. The remainder of the paper will be suggestions for 3 ways in which this might work on thinking through questions around decolonisation might lead to a reevaluation of MacDiarmid. So just to begin, contemporary calls for decolonisation within the universities of the global north identify a political, educational and epistemological task of critique. Reframing decolonisation as an unfinished project, they draw attention to the legacies of imperialism, not only within post-colonial states, but within the former imperial metropoles. They emphasise economic and social impacts as well as cultural ones, and they challenge the Eurocentric premises of the concepts and categories available to theorise political anti-colonialism. And notably for our purposes, that includes a long-running debate on the validity and efficacy of the nation state as a political form. So although in a number of ways, decolonial thought clearly extends and deepens themes prominent in earlier post-colonial theory, I want to emphasize today the challenge that it poses to the widespread adoption of what I will call weak post-colonial theory in British cultural and literary studies. And this is well illustrated in the case of Scotland. So post-colonial frameworks, as probably all of us know, and many of you will have contributed to this work, came to be absorbed into Scottish literary studies in the course of the 1990s, whereas a marginal strand of earlier work following Michael Hector's controversial internal colonialism thesis in the 1970s had seen colonialism or imperialism as primarily economic in focus. The turn to the post-colonial and literary studies is predominantly culturalist, so it sidesteps materialist analysis and it assumes the premise that Scottish cultural development can be understood as having been distorted through the colonial influence of English norms, as much as or more than through its involvement in the imperial project itself. And whatever its overt concerns, this allows for cultural production in Scotland to be read as a site of a generative struggle between different linguistic registers, cultural forms, and social and intellectual traditions. And in this process, Scottish literary critics found themselves coming into alignment with key motifs of MacDiarmid's own arguments against the ascendancy, as he puts it, of English styles and modes over Scottish traditions. Albeit recent critics also believed that they were witness to a contemporary literary revival, which was itself premised on the rejection of the mid-century Scottish modernism identified with MacDiarmid. Like MacDiarmid, these critical trends tend to evade the question of why earlier styles and tastes should now be considered passé. Unlike MacDiarmid, by collapsing the modernist distinction between art and culture, or kitsch, they ran the risk of celebrating the middlebrow and the formulaic. So this reading of MacDiarmid's cultural analysis in terms of the struggle for cultural recognition and interpreting his poetics as a vindication of the vernacular and the eccentric brings his work into alignment with writers of otherwise quite different political viewpoints. And that's kind of signaled in my quotation from Tom Leonard on the slide. And I think the continuity of the vocabulary of anti-imperialism on the global left obscures some of the kind of profound differences between MacDiarmid's communism and the views of later libertarian socialists like Leonard and Kelman, who actually have a much kind of stronger articulation of their own work with dissident writers in post-colonial contexts. So what emerged from this revaluation was what I take now to be a standard reading of MacDiarmid's political and aesthetic agenda as broadly being that of a decolonial nationalist writer rather than either a reactionary modernist or as a committed communist. Those were really the two positions which were being debated when I was a student of MacDiarmid. This reading seemed to resolve some of the contradictions in MacDiarmid's politics, so it was powerful in that sense, and it allows for sympathetic engagement with the fault lines and pressures in MacDiarmid's poetics as reflecting broader concerns within post-colonial modernisms. And as Fiona has just been saying, the categories of hybridity, a poetics of collage or montage, interest in the struggle around the idea of authenticity, and the poet as being representative of a people, all link MacDiarmid in some ways to other strands of post-colonial writing. Now, there are some obvious ambiguities within this picture, which is why it tends to be advanced kind of provisionally and more through analogy than through extended comparison. And as a more detached observer, Stephen Howe, the prominent historian of empire, has noted, MacDiarmid has been the most central figure to this construction of a post-colonial Scottish literary history. So this is going to be a long quotation from Stephen Howe. Scholars and critics have not only tracked down the scattered allusions to colonial politics and literatures in his work, and emphasized how his extraordinarily wide-ranging intellectual curiosity and political engagement embraced many colonial themes. Some have also urged that the quote, and our panel chair may recognize this quotation from his own book, the political evolution of MacDiarmid's poetry marks the shift from elitist modernism, indicative of the waning of British imperial control, to the ideal of a post-colonial society. Howe goes on, it must surely be added, though, that such colonial and anti-colonial themes feature in only a very small portfolio of the poet's writings, while although his interests may have been global, his activities were rather less so. Indeed, it is striking, he concludes, how far the literary political circles in which MacDiarmid moved included rather few non-Scots, still fewer non-Europeans, and almost literally no non-whites. So decolonial reading of MacDiarmid, we might say, could go beyond the post-colonial, but we might have to recognize, in line with Howe's response, that it might be a history of evasions and silence and of encounters missed or refused. I want to acknowledge here as well that there's a legitimate question which arises as to the extent to which any approach to literary history which continues to recenter a figure who has been so dominant in the field could itself be described as decolonial. So what would it take to trouble this kind of what I take as the established post-colonial reading of MacDiarmid? And I'm going to draw out three strands of inspiration from decolonial scholarship. So the first lesson to draw is that decolonization has tended to be viewed as an inexorable stage of historical development, which beginning in Europe spreads across the globe after the Second World War. But most contemporary work now strongly emphasizes the difference between what we might see as two waves of decolonization. So separating out the emergence of small European states from the late 19th century onwards and accelerating after World War I from the wave of decolonization in the rest of the world after the Second World War. And far from being the benign management of a kind of an inevitable dismantling of empire, this process, these activists and scholars emphasize, depended on the intellectual, cultural, and political struggle of colonized peoples and was met with violent resistance and contestation by European powers. So given MacDiarmid's emphasis on the historical context and engagement of his work, this might then give us a strong ground to re-establish a dividing line between that of his work of the 1920s and 1930s and his writing of the post-war period, on the grounds that the political international context for his work has drastically shifted. And this would make in memoriam James Joyce a fascinating test case because, as Alex has already mentioned, Jim has shown this in great detail, it's largely compiled of fragments written in the 1930s, whether by MacDiarmid or others, but assembled in a radically changed international political context, and whose vision of the world, and the idea of world language, draws very unevenly on potentially ethnocentric traditions of 19th century European philology, as well as committed interwar anti-colonial writers and activists like Leonard Woolf, although that may be a rather singular passage in the poem. So in the extraordinarily productive years of the 1920s and 30s, MacDiarmid is focused on establishing Scottish literature as a voice within the chorus of world literature, which, as in the quotation that Fiona used, he almost always uses in German, suggesting that the terms within which he sees this category do run directly back to Goethe, and that this sees both major and minor nations as having distinctive literary and cultural heritages. But in line with other kind of critical rereadings of this category, the the argument might be here that it tends to repeat the assumptions of the 18th century that the nation is a characteristic feature of European peoples only, and that therefore the category of world literature is an unreliable one because it's been involved in, if you like, a hierarchical stratification of the world literary space. So despite his repeated reference in this period to the decadence of Western civilization and the need for its renewal, my suggestion would be that MacDiarmid's historical understanding and his construction of kind of global culture in this period remains profoundly Eurocentric, so in need of some kind of provincialization. And what that might look like would be that displacing the terms of his own framework into a broader global history of decolonization would effectively subject it to critique, meaning here just taking a kind of a more distanced evaluative stance, which might allow for a kind of recontextualization of what's distinctive about his modernism of inner vision, the themes of a kind of poetics of silence, which come through at a lot of the critical points in his poetry, but that must be pursued through a crisis of authenticity and authority. So I think we could kind of establish new comparative frameworks, I guess, for understanding MacDiarmid once we step back a bit from the frameworks that he is proffering within which he wants his work to be received. A second line of inquiry, and again thinking in terms of this renewed demarcation between the two phases of his work, might be a careful reassessment of his anti-imperial political rhetoric. And I think recent work has tended to assume that this is that what he means here is the same through time, and that what he means is in line with post-colonial critique. But rather than looking for an underlying decolonial nationalism, I wonder if what this might explore would be the tensions which arise from the idiosyncratic equation he makes of the idea of English ascendancy, drawn from the vocabulary of Irish republicanism, with the long-standing Scottish tradition of response to Anglicisation as a marker for processes of social modernisation in general. So MacDiarmid's own stated interest here is in the spiritual failure which allows for that process in the first place, i.e. a rot that sets in well before the Reformation. Hence the nature of his kind of counter-reactionary modernism, which develops later into his adoption of a visionary communist ideal with only cursory reference to this historical process of Soviet imperialism, that being the other kind of strong reason to resist an easy decolonial reading of MacDiarmid. Now, this reading might also emphasize the degree to which empire functions as the assumed horizon for almost all British politics on the left and the right in the interwar years, with very few exceptions, explaining its strong presence as a theme within MacDiarmid's writing for the National Party of Scotland. And here, although historians such as Richard Findlay have cited MacDiarmid as evidence of what they see as a kind of extreme anti-imperialist wing within the early nationalist movement, I take the stronger strand in his work here to be that independence should be pursued within the framework of a decentralized imperial federation, a kind of form of utopianism in which the center is reconfigured through restoration of balance with the peripheries, which somewhat prefigures the devolution of English literature, or the archipelagic readings even called for by Robert Crawford and others in the 1990s. So to some extent, MacDiarmid is already ahead of the criticism that sought to receive him. And then finally, I wonder about the degree to which attention to MacDiarmid's kind of changing vocabulary of anti-imperialism can simply be understood as a straightforward adoption of communist rhetoric, so that anti-imperialism here really simply means anti-capitalism, which is understood as leading inexorably to militarism and war. And again, that explains that the idea of a post-colonial MacDiarmid or an anti-imperialist MacDiarmid is covering over some real political tensions, which he doesn't perhaps want to engage with in his work. And finally, and to wrap up, a third line of inquiry might engage with the shift from the more romantic account of world literature to this vision of world language in the late work. And it's great to see that there's so much kind of interest, I think, in In Memoriam James Joyce at the moment, as Fiona's work and Jim's work kind of suggest. And the question to be posed here, I think, goes beyond whether or not MacDiarmid makes a successful break with Eurocentrism, and the degree to which the poem perhaps embeds ideas around shared Indo-European heritage when he's thinking about the Celtic in particular, which undermines his attempt to think globally. So the struggle to rethink world literature as world language and to challenge not primarily linguistic imperialism, but capitalist processes of standardization has to be understood as internal to the poem itself. So in epistemological terms, this is the stake of the work, to distinguish the world from the universal. And then in political terms, authorized and to some extent corrupted, I think, by his alignment with Soviet communism, to distinguish between what he calls kinless cosmopolitanism, anything which is the product of imperialist capitalism, and true internationalism. And at this point, we come back to the tension between nationalism and internationalism, or the relationship between them, which kind of runs through his work of this period. So the task of a decolonial critique would be to kind of explore and challenge both the political and the epistemological frames that the poem proposes, through questioning of the terms that mediate his understanding of language, and to ask whether the distinctions he proposes can hold. And just to allude very briefly to the final line of work that's going on here, the long-running debate about the validity of the nation-state form and the effectiveness and efficacy of anti-colonial nationalism and its implications might, I think, be really helpful here, because the stress in a lot of recent rethinking of this work is the degree to which, if you like, a critique of the nation has to go through the nation, and that an international or global thinking either should or shouldn't have to reckon with the national. And that, I think, is the sort of the key outstanding debate in the reception of MacDiarmid's thought in general. So there's perhaps a lot to be done there as a sort of starting point for thinking more broadly about what we do with Scottish literary history. So that's me.
Many thanks, Alex. Many thanks indeed. Again, lots of questions I've been noting down for you later on. And again, if the audience have questions that they want to ask, please just continue to pop them in the Q&A. So our final speaker is Jim Benstead, who is Research Assistant for the Scottish Revival Network and co-organiser of this conference, and was recently a Research Assistant for another project at Edinburgh Napier University, A War Books Boom in Scotland, 1928 to 1932. His PhD thesis, which he completed in 2020, focuses on the ways in which MacDiarmid repurposed material from other writers in the composition of In Memoriam James Joyce. And his paper is called No Farther from the Centre of Things, Peripheral Citation in Memoriam James Joyce.
Thank you very much, Scott. My microphone's on, isn't it? Yes, great. And oh, one moment. And we've got the spotlight. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking today a bit about the source materials that MacDiarmid used in the composition of In Memoriam James Joyce. I have this kind of working document that I've been using for a number of years now, just to keep track of sources that I find. I'm just going to put it in the chat, so if you want to have a look at that at any point, then yeah, that's there. And if there's anything that you know of that's missing, let me know, and I can add it in. But if I click there, yeah, that's there. So, and that's working too. Cool. Okay, so in Devolving English Literature, Robert Crawford uses the idea of provincialism to locate MacDiarmid alongside Eliot and Pound as provincial modernists who operated from the peripheries of metropolitan cultural centres. Indeed, the peripherality of Wolsey, where MacDiarmid composed much of the material that would go on to be published in 1955 under the title In Memoriam James Joyce, is especially marked in the sense that it is peripheral even to the Shetland mainland. In this paper, I offer some examples of how this geographical and cultural peripherality are reflected in a formal peripherality that I identify within what I term MacDiarmid's citational poetics, his practice of selecting extracts from pre-existing texts before editing those extracts and then combining them together in his own work. In order to make this argument, I'm first going to propose a way to read MacDiarmid that emphasises both the source materials he chose to incorporate into his work and the way he edited and combined those materials. This approach considers how the meanings created through those techniques reinforce and contradict the meanings that can be identified through more conventional close reading of what I refer to as the surface text, that is, the words on the page considered independently to the sources from which they were taken. This way of reading MacDiarmid might seem to require some justification. We now have access to massive searchable databases of published texts, such as Google Books and the Times Literary Supplement Historical Archive, which allow us to find many of MacDiarmid's sources with relative ease, and even to imagine automated search projects that would work through the complete poems, available as an electronic text via ProQuest's Literature Online, and query each line in every available database. Yet neither MacDiarmid himself nor any of In Memoriam's readers on the text's first publication in 1955, or indeed at least until 2004 when Google Books was launched, would have had access to any of this information. A thorough examination of this idea is beyond the scope of this paper. However, I'm basing my analysis of In Memoriam on two ideas that can be substantiated with reference to the text. Firstly, both the form and the content of the text itself invites the sort of reading that I'm proposing here. And secondly, the different readers, that different readers would be expected to be aware of differing subsets of In Memoriam source materials. Both of these ideas are present in this extract from the first section of the text. Bruitist here refers to the musical philosophy. Bruitism, described in the 1913 Futurist Manifesto, The Art of Noises, as the incorporation into musical works of sounds traditionally thought to be non-musical, such as sounds generated by machinery. And simultaneist refers to simultaneism, a kind of literary cubism developed in the 1910s as an attempt to present multiple viewpoints at the same time. This passage is suggestive, of course, of the way in which In Memoriam has been composed from its source materials. But the reference to simultaneism also illustrates a key implication of the text's citational poetics. Certainly no individual reader would have as complete a knowledge of In Memoriam sources as is now available, and any attempt to specify which sources any individual reader would be aware of would inevitably be largely speculative. But this means that the text's literary cubism is not only a factor in its composition, it's also present in the reception of the work, with the text's different readers each bringing their own distinct viewpoints to the text as determined by their distinct individual knowledge of its source materials. And this idea can be used to reframe modern database-driven readings from being in some way artificial and distanced from the readings MacDiarmid might have expected, towards an imagining of the communal readings that might emerge if the text had a sufficiently large readership that had pooled its fragmented knowledge of In Memoriam source materials, an idea that resonates with the community of insight described in the text dedication. The idea of centre and periphery is alluded to explicitly in Memoriam in a way that evokes the allusions the text makes to its citation of poetics, and also provides an interesting example of those poetics. Around 2/3 of the way through the first section of the text, the speaker contends that we are no further from the centre of things, no farther from the great warm heart of humanity, or the general good, no less central to human destiny, when alone with a work of scholarship that can only appeal to perhaps one person per million. This passage is especially interesting in the context of the difficulties involved in determining whether an individual reader of In Memoriam would identify a specific source that MacDiarmid had incorporated within the text. In this instance, we can assume that many readers would be familiar with the stanza's origins, and in fact, in these specific circumstances, because of Fiona's paper earlier, I think you're all familiar with the stanza's origins, as MacDiarmid's source here is, at least in the first instance, the first stanza of his poem in the Shetland Islands, which he had published in the author's note to the Islands of Scotland in 1939. We might imagine the experience of a reader then who encounters this passage in Memoriam for the first time, recognises it, and then takes a copy of the Islands of Scotland down from the shelf to compare the two texts side by side, a process that shares interesting similarities with how a reader might use a glossary of Scots words when reading the Scots lyrics or A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle. The most extensive changes made during the incorporation of this material within In Memoriam occur in the passage's first 5 lines, which we've got on the right there, which map onto the first 6 lines within the Shetland Islands, which are on the left, as it appears in the islands of Scotland. In both the 1939 text and the 1955 text, the speaker appears to rebut the idea that they are cut off from something that is in some sense central, or at least centered. Indeed, both texts locate themselves on some sort of periphery and then speak from that periphery in order to call into question the abstract idea of the center by referring to it through a series of cliches that are marked out as such through the use of quotation marks. The center of things, the great warm heart of humanity, the general good, and central to human destiny. But the process through which the speaker is cut off from this central or centered thing differs between the 2 texts. The next point, I think, resonates with a question that was in the Q&A there and that arose following Alex Linklater's talk at the start. The speaker has firstly transformed from the lyric or quasi-lyric I am present in the 1939 text into a diffused communal we are in the 1955 text. And this change is concomitant with the elimination of the idea of physical geographical location. This effect is achieved through the deletion of the second line in the 1939 text and the editing of the last 2 lines. We lose the reference to the speaker being in the Shetlands and being absent from the metropolitan centres of London, New York, and Tokyo, but we also lose the idea of the speaker being in any physical location, as the image of the speaker sitting alone here, and also now implied by the I am of the first line, is replaced with the abstract when alone with a work of scholarship. Indeed, the speaker in Memoriam is never identified as being present in a physical location. As readers, all we know is that the text intends to transport us to the Airnac or solitary place of union that the speaker welcomed Joyce to a few hundred lines into the poem, where its description as our Airnac suggests that it is already populated with multiple voices. The physical peripherality evoked in the 1939 text certainly implies an intellectual peripherality, but the way in which the text is transformed to arrive at the 1955 text removes the physical origins of this peripherality so that only the intellectual peripherality remains. The point of comparison for the speaker's position, though, is the same in both texts. Anonymous and anonymizing crowds and queues, and the spectator at Twickenham or Murrayfield at Ibrox. There's an interesting suggestion here, I think, of Glasgow 1960, the poem that MacDiarmid had published in 1935. But this reduces the individual to a unit, adrift in a modern mass culture represented by a selection of today's newspapers. Those newspapers are then themselves counterpointed by the introduction into the text of a catalogue of academic titles and their authors. In the 1939 text, then, the speaker's physical isolation is contrasted with the absence of physical isolation when in a crowd in an urban centre, whereas in the 1955 text, it is the speaker's intellectual isolation that is contrasted with the subjective experience of being an individual within such a crowd. In Memoriam, the geographical peripherality of Wolsey evolves into a sense of peripherality that is found within the text itself. This idea of textual peripherality and of challenging and potentially inverting the centre-periphery opposition can also be identified in the opening pages of the second section of In Memoriam, The World of Words. The third stanza of this section, which is in the slide there, or the start of it, is 220 lines long, and is largely constituted of a catalogue of author title pairs. This catalogue is an extended version of the technique that MacDiarmid had used in the second half of the Centre of Things stanza, in which he uses throughout In Memoriam in order to introduce a multiplicity of thematically connected ideas that are often expressed tersely and which run into and crowd in upon each other. In 1956, Edwin Morgan, the best early critic of In Memoriam, compared these catalogues with the quasi-academic bibliographies in Finnegan's wake, arguing that, unlike Joyce, MacDiarmid didn't recognise the cumulative comic effect created by this technique. However, in 1982, Morgan revisited his evaluation and concluded that MacDiarmid was more aware of the comic potential of such lists than he had previously been taken to be. An analysis of the opening lines of The World of Words supports Morgan's later evaluation and identifies a comically playful impulse that is present in both the surface text and also in the way in which In Memoriam selects, transforms, and combines its source materials, and which contributes to the way in which the text complicates the idea of textual peripherality. The long catalogue stanza retains the diffused communal speaker used elsewhere in Memoriam and has them initiate the catalogue with a statement that misdirects readerly expectations. We have, of course, studied thoroughly Alspach, English, and the others who have written on psychological response to unknown proper names. In the previous section of the text, the speaker engages with ideas relating to constructed languages such as Basic English, Occidental, Interlingua, and Novial, and sets the challenge of constructing a new language that maintains a cultural neutrality by drawing on the entirety of the vast international vocabulary. Taken in isolation, on a first reading, the meaning of Alspach is not clear. However, when placed next to English, it becomes a name for one of these constructed languages, potentially a play on all speak. But the second half of the line undermines this reading with the phrase "who have written," recontextualizing Alspach and English. And these are not, in fact, languages, constructed or otherwise, but are the names of authors. And these authors are cited as having written on psychological response to unknown proper names. That is precisely the phenomenon experienced by a reader when encountering the names Alspach and English in this new context. This reveal uses the structure of a simple joke, a paraprostokion, where the reader has assumed a specific cultural frame for the first few words of the catalogue's opening lines, only to realise that this context was incorrect. This resonates, of course, with the humour that Morgan ends up identifying in the repetition of the catalogue structure, but it also alludes to the shifts in context that are playing out in the formal processes that are at work in the construction of the catalogue from its source materials. The vast majority of the long second stanza of The World of Words is taken from a single source, the American psychologist June Downey's 1929 book Creative Imagination, Studies in the Psychology of Literature. But while Downey's text is the main source for this passage, the references to authors and titles that appear in Memoriam are taken from that text's footnotes. And while most of the author title pairs are presented without further reference to or description of the work in question, where the catalogue does incorporate material from the main text of Downey's work, it does so only having first cited the text of a corresponding footnote, thereby giving that footnote precedence. Overall, the effect here is that the centre and the periphery of the texts have been inverted, so that the context within which the reader encounters this material is suddenly changed in a way that evokes the surprising change of context that underpins the humour in the Alspach English joke. One of the most surprising examples of the way in which In Memoriam recontextualizes peripheral source materials can be found in the passage that immediately precedes this catalogue. In the context of the constructed language the speaker proposed in the previous section of the text, the idea and word chart described in this stanza seems to suggest a technique or device that can facilitate the work of constructing this language, one that is related perhaps to the thinking graphics outlined in the previous section of the text, with which Patrick Geddes juggled words like algebraic terms to gain a clearness of idea impossible to get through prose exposition alone, in order to arrive at a description of living that included or could include every act and fact, dream and deed of all mankind on this planet. And clear parallels with what's going on in this quotation. However, MacDiarmid's source here is in fact an example of the advertising copy that the speaker of In Memoriam had described as a potential source for his simultaneist poems. The material is taken from a print advertisement presented in Memoriam, more or less in its original form, for a vocabulary aid, branded as an idea and word chart, which was produced and sold by the Psychology Publishing Company Limited of Marple, Cheshire. Rather than being some sort of Gedesian tool intended to navigate the intricacies of MacDiarmid's proposed world language, the idea and word chart was in fact designed to encourage readers to pay the Psychology Publishing Company to send them a descriptive brochure. The nature of print advertising means that this source appeared in multiple issues of a number of different publications in the second half of the 1940s, including many publications that MacDiarmid is likely to have read. This makes it relatively difficult to determine precisely where MacDiarmid took this material from. And indeed, he may have encountered it on multiple occasions in different contexts before deciding to incorporate it within his own work. But this perhaps means that MacDiarmid's initial readership would have been relatively more likely to identify this source, having potentially seen it repeated in print in multiple publications on a weekly basis. This identification creates a striking effect, with peripheral paratextual material being centered in a way that invites a potentially knowing readership to read that material in new ways. Alan Riak has described, for example, how the tone and syntax of verse combine to effect a spontaneity of announcement and affirmation. Read in this way, this stanza seems most similar to reflective lyric passages of In Memoriam, such as the Hawthorn Tree passage in the first section of the text, the Harebell passage in the Snares of Varuna, and the Realm of Music passage at the start of Plaited Like the Generations of Men. But while each of these cases involves the transformation of prose into verse, they're all derived from descriptive, linguistically rich prose sources, a novel, a newspaper article about visiting the English countryside, and a letter from a musician to his wife describing a transcendent realm of music. Here, In Memoriam demonstrates that the same effects can be achieved with supposedly utilitarian material like advertising copy, once it is decontextualized and recentered. And it does so in a humorous way, with the forceful change of context that underpins the construction of this stanza, prefiguring the Ausbach English joke that immediately follows. In this paper, I've demonstrated how In Memoriam James Joyce can be read by considering the source materials that MacDiarmid used in its composition, and how those source materials were brought together to create the text that was published in 1955. As I have argued, approaching In Memoriam in this way and undertaking this approach alongside more traditional readings of its surface text highlights a formal peripherality that mirrors cultural and geographical peripherality within which MacDiarmid composed the text, and which is both highly experimental and playfully comic. But perhaps the more important point here is the value of the reading strategy itself, facilitated by the ease with which we can now locate many of MacDiarmid's sources. As Patrick Crotty has recently discovered, the Continental Sonnets, published in the Scottish Chapbook under the name C.M. Grieve in 1922 and 1923, were each sourced from material that had appeared in the Times Literary Supplement between September 1921 and November 1922. The TLS is by far the most common source in Memoriam, which suggests that we might think of the massive citational work that MacDiarmid undertook following his relocation to Wolsey as a return to or continuation of Grieve's pre-MacDiarmid work, rather than as an inferior deviation from the Scots work of the 1920s. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jim. Sorry, I was struggling to get my unmute myself. Thank you very much. That was tremendous. Great stuff. And thank you to all of our speakers, all of our panelists for their excellent papers. So over really to you, the audience, to ask any questions you might have. We have one comment, really, I think more than a question in here, from Murdo McDonald, who says, fascinating stuff, Jim. An interesting sidelight on CMG's liberal approach to quotation is shared by his lack of hesitation in using attributed quotes in the company I've kept. For example, the first quote from George Davy is 1,000 words. And John Corbett says, all great papers, thanks. If anyone else has got any questions, then just pop them in the chat or raise your hand and we can take them as we go along. In the meantime, whilst you're thinking of questions, I'll probably start off with a few. I mean, I think quite a lot of kind of interesting connections going on in all of those papers, and thank you for them. Clearly, a kind of main theme is peripherality and the ways in which perhaps his own geographical peripherality in the 1930s seems to play out through the kind of methods that he adopts as a poet. Perhaps, Jim, you might want to kind of comment on that first a bit more. You talked about, for instance, the TLS being a kind of main source for much of what's in Memoriam James Joyce. And it has been commented in the past on the nature of MacDiarmid's or Grieve's peripherality being kind of a problematic aspect rather than how he kind of sells it, which he is at the center of things, but actually in terms of getting his hands on sources, there was a kind of trickiness there. And hence, perhaps, is that part of why the method is adopted, to kind of use source texts that really are not his own?
I think it certainly helps. I've never worked out where he got access to a TLS subscription. There's some letter somewhere where he says that his subscription's lapsed, but it seems that he turns up in Wolsey. He has this exchange with Ezra Pound where he says, "You've read my review of your work. I'm a complete fraud. I've got access to no books here." But then he builds up this sort of body of work that he can, like a physical body of work that he can draw on in Wolsey. So yes, I'm sure it helped, and he got hold of a TLS sub somewhere. But it's more complicated than that, because if you go back to the early 20s, he's using the TLS there when he has access to whatever he needs. When he comes back to Glasgow, he's still, if you go through that link I put in the chat, one of the tabs at the bottom shows all of the TLS sources in kind of date order, and you see that when he goes back to revise the text before he's publishing it, he goes back to the TLS. So it may have been that moving to Wolsey, he's like, wow, I've remembered that I used to use the TLS as a source, and that's very convenient. But it then becomes, I think, part of his chosen practice. I mean, to the point where there's one bit that I'm aware of in In Memoriam where it looks very much like he's read a review of something in the TLS. He's quoted from the thing that the editor of the reviewer in the TLS is quoting, but then he's gone and got the book out of the library and actually extended it further because there's material in Memoriam that isn't there. So I think it's complicated, but there's an element of it certainly where having pre-digested stuff was helpful, if you like.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. Fiona, I wondered if you could talk a bit more about this archipelagic idea. One of the things that I've always kind of wondered about that is, you know, if you read someone like John Brannigan, the idea of an archipelagic modernism, I suppose, is about fluidity, is about joining particularly the islands of Britain and Ireland together in a kind of cultural mix. How does that sit in your mind if you want to propose MacDiarmid as an archipelagic poet with his more kind of nationalist politics? I mean, do those things not collide rather than combine?
I guess that kind of comes back to that what Alex was talking about a bit as well, about the kind of tensions between nationalism and internationalism, which are always kind of at the centre of how we talk about MacDiarmid. But I guess how I was approaching the idea of MacDiarmid as an archipelagic writer is a way of explaining, or a way of looking at his internationalism, I suppose, about the way that he is connecting small nations, I suppose, not even that are necessarily classically considered as islands, I suppose, as in it's not, you know, the British Isles, but seeing them as physically disconnected and yet connected through language, through cultural shares, through travels that like people have done between the places. And I don't think it takes away from his nationalism, because it's kind of based on, I suppose, like the idea of like comparative nationalisms in those places as well. So it's about sort of supporting the autonomy of these cultures or peripheral places. I don't know if that really helps, but I guess I feel like it doesn't really have to go against his nationalism at all, because that comes into the distinctness of the island in that kind of visual.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I thought there were kind of interesting kind of connections, very interesting connections between yours and Alex's talk. And Alex, you, I mean, if I'm reading you right, you're saying that essentially MacDiarmid really isn't an anti-imperialist as we would kind of understand that phrase, that that relates to a different kind of politics, that perhaps a kind of anti-capitalism more per se, and perhaps even relates more to his communism than anything else? That's kind of question to Alex Thompson.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, I have been wondering, and the interesting conversation that's kind of going on in the comments in response to Alex Linklater's paper about our wanting to ascribe a kind of center to MacDiarmid's kind of cultural production, which is performative as well. And I think you could include his political engagements and his acts of political discourse in that as well. We have wanted to attribute something which underlies and underpins all of that. And I think, yes, I'm suspicious about the view that it is simply anti-colonial in the way that we have wanted it to be in the last 20 years, I guess. And I think there is space for a much more fine-grained contextualization, and that the kind of work that Jim is doing with the poetic text could be done with some of the political writing as well, as I think. And as ever, a lot of this is quotation, and a lot of it is favored quotation, which he hangs on to and kind of repeats. And I think that would be an essential ground clearing exercise before we could make the kind of comparisons between what I completely agree with, how Fiona is approaching the aesthetics of kind of collage and montage in MacDiarmid's work. But when we make the comparison, which is an incredibly loaded and high stakes comparison with writing in a post-colonial context, what I think the decolonial perspective stresses is that there's a risk there of kind of comparing all peripheries and overlooking or stepping too quickly beyond very kind of problematic historical processes and legacies. So it's that redressing of the balance, and that I do wonder if that would tip us back towards, as we've been kind of thinking about today a little bit, the kind of the modernism of Pound, as opposed to a kind of you know, an Aimé Césaire kind of comparison, and whether it might also reactivate our sense of the communism. And actually, I'm going to doff my hat to your paper on MacDiarmid's communism in the kind of community collection, because I think that's a really interesting way of drawing out the just the hyperbolic and the visionary and the ideal within it, which is an obvious tension with his actual political commitment to or his professed political commitment to support kind of Stalinism in 1956. But it's not an alien kind of mismatch, if you like, when you put him in line with some of those European thinkers that you're kind of drawing connections with. I think he embraces some of the inevitable contradictions of avant-gardism in politics and philosophy, which we're pretty you know, cagey about in the Anglophone world, but which are courted by some strands of continental thought. So that it's a really interesting comparison.
Thank you, Alex. I'm just going to catch up with some of the comments in the chat. John Corbett says, Giacomo Bianchino and Alex Linklater have an interesting exchange on the validity of superimposing a lyrical eye on modernist poetry when such poetry is impersonal and resists biographical interpretation. The parallels are not only interesting, but they may explain why CMG Hugh MacDiarmid denies a convincing subjective account of himself. It's genuinely not what modernist poets were interested in. Alex Linklater, what do you kind of make of that? I saw you responded to an earlier question on this idea of a kind of first-person lyrical eye. Kind of what do you make of that? And how does one write a biography of someone as ghost-like as the person that you describe CMG or Hugh MacDiarmid to be? In fact, who are you writing the biography of? Is it CMG or Hugh MacDiarmid?
CMG. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not even sure he invented MacDiarmid. I think other people sort of read out from him. There are two ways of interpreting his work biographically, and one was the one that essentially Patrick Crotty deconstructed in the first paper, which is that you ask, you know, is he writing about himself in some way? That's that's not what, and I'm not going to talk about poetics because I'm in the in the den of scholars here. So I'm just going to talk about what I think I understand, which is why somebody behaves the way they do, and I think the other way of looking at his work biographically is by going, who is it? What kind of a person actually writes like this? Not the content of the poem, not whether the Watergore is about his father or not, but who constructs work in such a way that it creates worlds in this way. And I think one of the problems you have, one of the difficulties, I should say, in looking at his work overall is simply its incoherence in terms of subject matter, or any of the conventional means of interpreting a body of work. Structure, he has no overall structure that I can tell, but what he does have is a very peculiar way of inhabiting the world of words and his own poetry, and of writing, a very peculiar way of writing it, frankly. And I think, if we were going to talk about peripheries, I think that, perhaps you're looking at CMG more as an outsider artist, and I don't just mean as an outsider, I mean as someone who is an atypical personality writing from quite an abnormal kind of psychology. And I think that's where he's, for me anyway, the most interesting. Obviously he's interesting to me because he's the biographical subject, and I think that explains why he writes the way he does, if that's not too reductive and simplistic.
Do you have a particular method of your own? I mean, are you coming from, I don't know, a Freudian perspective? Is there any particular perspective that from an academic perspective, people, yeah, we've heard Alex talking about a weak post-colonialism that seemed to characterize Scottish literary studies for a certain spell. Is there a particular method or framework that you're adopting in order to look at this atypical personality?
Well, I would say I spent a lot of time during a period of research I did in the psychiatric world, moving between Freudian type psychoanalysts on the one hand, and then the more modern kind of cognitive psychologists on the other, and then the medical kind of DSM categorization of personalities that you would get in the psychiatric world. And what I tended to find is that when I was amongst the psychoanalysts, I saw the cognitive perspective, and when I was among the cognitivists, I saw the psychoanalytic perspective. I think really what I discovered working with a variety of different unusual personalities, if you like, which ranges from just extreme people to psychiatric patients, is that what was interesting about them was the model that worked for them was the one that they responded to. So it's not so much having a fixed perspective on what you mean by personality or how you think about the psychology of a writer, which is, this is extremely dodgy territory, let's say, but it's more about finding the kind of language that works with the kind of person that they are. So you look at their lives, you look at his life story, you start looking at the fascinating way you cannot tell a lot of the time when what he's talking about is what's actually happening and when it's not. And quite often you will find that something is clearly, if you look into it, it simply is not true. And then other times you think that can't be true, that's nonsense. And you start digging around and you find that it has exactly happened the way he said it has. And so he's constantly worrying or surprising you in that way. But what the most interesting aspect for me is just that difficulty of distinguishing when it's between when he's describing something real and when he's describing something that's not. And that's if you're looking for a methodology, it's basically to hang fire between what's real and what is not in his own accounts of himself.
Thanks, Alex. We've got a question in the chat from Robert Hodgart. He says, this is very probably a naive question from a human geographer with interests in Scottish culture, history and politics, etc., and a limited knowledge of 20th century literature. I've read very little of In Memoriam James Joyce, but I was rather shaken by Alex Linklater's statement, which I think he was referring to Jim's findings, that a huge amount of its text, that's In Memoriam James Joyce, 60% or so, was essentially plagiarized from other authors and texts. Doesn't this seriously undermine its literary and substantive value and validity? If so, why is so much attention paid to it? That is a great question. I'm going to kind of ask you each actually in turn what you think about the plagiarism, because it's kind of come up in most of what most of you were saying, really, in this panel, even to the extent of Alex Linklater, when you open drawing parallels potentially between a plagiaristic method and a personality that one cannot find. So maybe starting with Alex Linklater, just what do you make of the plagiarism? What does the plagiarism do to MacDiarmid as a personality in terms of your assessment of that personality? And what perhaps as a second part of that question, I'm going to ask you all this, what does it do to the poetry as poetry? Unfair, horrible question.
I know. I'm. Thank you for asking me first, because I just want to get the perfect controversy out of the way. I assume everyone knows what it was, the exchange of letters in the TLS, where Glyn Jones rumbles MacDiarmid for stealing his lines for the frankly perfect lyric, perfect, and then there is this exchange of letters where Ciedrich Rhys, another Welsh writer, joins in and says, actually, I was the first one to plagiarize that. And MacDiarmid goes, rubbish, I'm the original misappropriator, is the word he uses for himself. And it's absolutely fantastic exchange of what I was talking about before. You really are not sure what's going on with MacDiarmid or Christopher, as I should say, as he responds to these accusations. And I would just say, I don't think he's really sure himself. That's the feature that comes out of it most, or that's all I can come away with it from. And I think that when it comes to the spectrum, shall we say, of his, creative transformations and adaptations of found material, all the way through to his copy and pasting of elements of, or possibly all of, In Memoriam James Joyce. I don't think he certainly doesn't ever articulate himself a methodology. He doesn't do what William Burroughs does. He doesn't say, look, I'm chopping up prose, I'm a radical writer, my method is new and exciting. He does it without, I think, really formulating, if I dare say this, in his own mind, what it is that he's doing as a poet. It's just the way he has to write, as I say, because of the kind of person he is.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I'm going to come to Jim next, because Jim, your contention is that this as a method has been going on from really the start, and you referred to Patrick Crotty's discoveries and what that means in relation to how we think about MacDiarmid's career in a more holistic sense. So perhaps you could comment.
I've thought about this for far too long, so I was going to give a full answer, we've gone for hours, but just the sort of edited highlights, if you like. There's a great book by Marilyn Randall called Pragmatic Plagiarism, where she makes this argument that plagiarism is really a legal category. It has a particular history. If we go back a couple of thousand years, the idea of borrowing from one culture and bringing it into our own culture was really quite normal. I guess like one highlight from that, she points out that modern forms of colonialism would often export the culture of the colonizing power to the places that were colonized. So you end up with a McDonald's opening in Beirut or whatever. But she points out that if we go back to kind of Greece and Rome, it was the other way around, that the colonizing power, or the power that was taking over, would incorporate what it saw as the cultural highlights from the place that it was taking over, or that it was kind of superseding. So that's a general kind of point about that, and it's a massive subject, I think. For MacDiarmid in particular, yeah, to pick up on what Alex Linklater was saying there is this debate where MacDiarmid supposedly gets caught for nicking this stuff that he uses to write Perfect. That debate then brings in a whole bunch of people who they all come out of the woodwork, basically. And MacDiarmid's initial position is, I didn't know what I was doing, I'm very sorry. And then as he's sort of discovered, he eventually says, well, good artists copy, great artists steal. That's what T.S. Eliot said. And then everyone sort of stops. But the interesting thing for me is that if you go back to the author's note in Annals of the Five Senses, he says, I've taken this material from all sorts of places. I don't know where it's come from. I've tried to provide citations where I can, but most of the time I couldn't. And this is the nature of the text. So while Alex is totally right that he isn't doing the kind of William Burroughs thing and saying, this is what I'm doing, I think the status is pretty ambiguous, really. And I think that ultimately he starts writing like that. The fact that he talks about it in the author's note to Annals suggests that he thinks it's a bit of a weird way to go about it. But then that's just his way of doing things. And by the 30s, 50s, whatever, he just doesn't think about it in any more depth than that. So, yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Fiona, what do you think about this? Also, you're doing a PhD on MacDiarmid right now, and you argued, I think, very, very well and persuasively for the later poetry in particular as a vision of world language as a kind of anti-standardization. What is the notion of a kind of plagiarizing method do to that? How do you feel about that?
Well, I guess I think when it comes down to looking at the poetry as poetry, which was kind of the second part of your question, I guess I don't think the plagiarism matters, which is maybe that's a bit controversial, I don't know, but I think it comes back to what Jim was saying in his paper earlier, that I guess when MacDiarmid's writing this stuff, he's not, I assume, expecting people to be reading it armed with, your Google books and your internet search engine kind of thing. So through one way, I think it's really helpful to read it completely kind of not thinking about that side, like not going down the kind of rabbit hole of where things came from and how he could have found them and who gave him this source and did he actually read this, but just to read it in the sense of the poem, because he is, transforming it from prose into poetry. He's kind of shifting things around. Sometimes it just seems like the chopped up prose, but sometimes he's kind of, playing with it a little bit more. So I don't think it matters too much in a sense, but then of course, yeah, it's very helpful as well it's interesting, it's fascinating to see where he's getting his material from. So I guess in a non kind of legal sense, I don't think it matters. In a creative sense, I think it's quite fun, but I think it is kind of speaking to this sort of, I guess like the kind of unconscious way that we do pick up language or ideas, or we kind of absorb things in the world around us, which I think is quite a human way of kind of processing material and developing the way we think about things. And I think to a large part of it is just sort of trying to make sense of the world through what he's given or what he reads. Some of that is completely happenstance, like he happens upon something, he's given something to read. He reads things for reviews earlier on, like when he's as part of his journalism, which then later on make its way into his poetry as well. So he's maybe reading it for a purpose there. And then we have some cases where he's specifically seeking out texts, and I think, or he's adding in references or, taking quotes or phrases or whole passages quite late on into the writing process. So like in Memoriam James Joyce, we have the Karl Kraus passage, which comes from the TLS. In The Battle Continues, he refers to a text that's written in 1957, although most of it comes from 1930s. So I guess his approach is kind of this like half sort of, spontaneous, happening upon sources, half sort of research. And so I think that's kind of a good way to approach it as readers or as scholars now, is to kind of just read it, sit with it, see how it feels. But then also have that kind of like one eye on the sources, which, as Jim's been really helpful in kind of unveiling.
Well, yeah. Thanks, Fiona. There's a few hands up from the audience, but I'm just going to come to Alex Thompson first, because I just said I would ask all of you your thoughts on this. And I wonder if Alex has got any thoughts on this from a political perspective, indeed from a decolonizing perspective. What's the politics of plagiarism, I suppose, in relation to what MacDiarmid is up to in relation to what you're arguing, Alex?
I can't generate a formed thought on that, but I think what I would add to what everyone said, which I pretty much agree with, that it is a consistent way of working, which he owns up to, which he doesn't see as invalidating the personal statement within it. I think there's a genuine kind of it is a madness of literary criticism to attribute intentionality to just bad work. So I'm aware of that risk. But I like to think of this as a kind of a confrontation between different ideas of what a poet should be. So it's the pressure to be original, authentic, to be the lucky poet. That there's a I think Alex called it an anti-biography, an anti-autobiography, that he performs the sort of the lad of parts, the sentimental child of nature, all of these ideas of what a poet should be in post-romantic culture. And he performs this in collision with the discourse of the modern world and the immense weight of all of these kind of competing scholars. Because if anyone's read any of that list that Jim was using as an example, they can't all agree. Knowledge isn't additive in that way. It's kind of conflictual. So I see it as a kind of the expression of sort of complicated fault lines about the nature of what the poetry is. And if you want to add a political reading, I think there is a degree to which that's a kind of a crisis in the figure of the need to be a national bard, and his conscious awareness of the presence of Burns kind of at the back of everything. So I think there's a political dimension about what it means for a nation to be original as expressed through the voice of its poet, when all that there can be is the kind of artificial recycling of discourse.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. I'm going to come to Patrick Frottier next, who I'm hopefully allowing to talk now.
Right.
So, Patrick, are you? No, you're not.
Hello. Sorry, I just wanted to respond to Alex's response. Alex, you said that he took some lines from Glyn Jones, but surely the point is that he didn't. He took a sentence from Glyn Jones and changed it into lines. And in the lineation of Perfect, he created a poem that Glyn Jones didn't write, that MacDiarmid made. That's all.
I completely agree. I thought that's what
No, you said he took lines from Glyn Jones.
He took about three-quarters of them.
No, but he didn't. No, sorry, I'm just picking you up on a particular locution. You said he took lines from Glyn Jones.
A line, beg your pardon.
No, but he didn't. He didn't take a line. There was no line in Glyn Jones. It was prose, so it didn't have a line.
Oh, I see. He took words.
He's making the point.
He lifted words from Glyn Jones
and
turned them into a poem. But I.
Sorry, I'm laboring the point. But yes. it's by making the prose, by lineating it, he created the poem and changed the nature of the utterance.
I agree.
I'm sort of agreeing with you, really, but I'm just saying that you're.
But I'm agreeing right back.
Yes. I'm agreeing more vociferously than you. I'm simply saying that your use of the word lines actually brought us to the heart of the matter, which is, his contribution was lineation, and it transformed everything. Yes. Sorry, that's all.
Could I add to that though, because it was the point I I'll just double agree with Patrick there. And also thank you for picking me up on my less than.
Sorry, but I'm actually approving of what you said, really.
Right, okay. I'd like to pick up on something Fiona said, if I can briefly, and I don't want to corral this conversation too much, but I think it's a similar point that Fiona was making about, you know, to what extent does the plagiarism matter in terms of judging the poetry and our response to it. I think when the effects are great, it doesn't matter. And sometimes, surprisingly, it really does matter. So I think if you took the Island Funeral, for example, which if you look online, you'll find people from the Hebrides saying, this is exactly the kind of funeral I grew up with, this is an authentic experience, and so on. And then you discover that it is lifted from an anthropological study of Shaker villages in Maine. And actually, I don't think the Island Funeral can survive that. I think there are certain poems, if you fact check them and find out that their source material is really that inauthentic, then I think the poem falls apart, especially when you read some of, you wonder what people are thinking when they say this was exactly like the experience I had growing up in Lewis in the 1920s or something. You know, it's quite strange. I think poetry can be subjected to fact checking in that respect, and plagiarism in others in MacDiarmid too.
Thanks, Alex. I'm just going to take, there's just one comment in the chat that I'm just going to kind of add on to this because he's also got his hand up, and I don't think we've kind of run out of time. So just, Michael Whitworth says in the chat on the plagiarism question, it would be interesting to know the extent to which plagiarism was an established practice in local, regional and national journalism in the 1910s and 20s, and therefore the extent to which his practice was a continuation of it, which I think is a really interesting comment. But I'm afraid we're kind of out of time there, so I'm going to kind of bring things to a close, if that's also all right with Jim. And say thank you very, very, very much to our panelists this afternoon, Alex Linklater, Jim himself, Alex Thompson, and Fiona Patterson. And thanks again to our panelists this morning, Patrick Grotte, Alan Raick, and Michael Whitworth himself. Thanks to the audience for coming along. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. And we have a couple of more Scottish Revival Network events still to come. There'll be one on Global Scottish Revival, which is our next event. We don't have a date for that yet, but it will probably be happening late autumn-ish. So please look out for that. We will send out communications on that and be tweeting about that. So please look out for that and please come along to that. And then there'll be a final event in the kind of late winter, early new year, but the late winter, so 2023. Finally, I just want to share news of, in case you don't know, so I should be sharing my screen of a forthcoming Hugh MacDiarmid conference, not organised by us, not organised by the Revival Network, but organised in the main, well, amongst others, but in the main by Camille Manfredi. This is taking place at the University of Western Brittany in Brest, in France, in mid-June next year, so the 15th and 16th of June 2023. I think the plan is that this will be an in-person event, and if so, that would be wonderful. I'm certainly looking forward to hopefully going along to that, and I think there's a call for papers which is live right now, and I think if you want any more information about that conference, then do please email Camille Manfredi at the University of Brest. Jim, do you have any kind of closing thoughts that you want to add? Or?
No, that's been a really good day. Thanks to all the panelists from this morning and this afternoon. It's yeah, a lot to kind of reflect on and think about. Yeah, thank you very much.
Absolutely, yes. Thanks very much from me too, and we'll say cheerio. Bye bye.